I'm Elizabeth Curry Chandler. I'm a journalist and writer who, together with my husband, co-founded the website Goodreads, an adventure that completely took over our lives. Today I'm editor-in-chief of Goodreads, and I'm still doing what I've always loved to do, interviewing and writing about creative and dynamic people. For this podcast, I'm talking to the world's most interesting people about what they're reading and why. I first met Will Schwalbe in the early years of Goodreads. At the time, Will was the former editor-in-chief at Hyperion, the first to publish celebrity chef Jamie Oliver in the US. He left Hyperion to start the site Cookster in 2008, the world's best collection of cookbook recipes online. Goodreads was only 1 year old, and my husband and co-founder Otis met up with Will in New York City. It was instant synergy, and he became an official advisor for the first 6 years of Goodreads. Will has also published 2 best-selling books of his own, The End of Your Life Book Club and Books for Living. If anyone knows about the right books to change your life, it's Will. That's why I'm so excited to catch up and hear about all the books you recommended. Thanks so much for agreeing to talk to me, Will.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be on your podcast, Elizabeth.
I think we should start off just by talking about the books that you've written. Can you tell me a little bit about your most recent book, Books for Living?
Well, Books for Living was a real joy to write, and it was so fun to write because it's a book about 26 books that really found me when I needed them most. But way more than that, it's a book about how all different kinds of books can tell you what you need to do in life. Maybe it will be a mystery that teaches you who you can trust and who you can't. So I write about The Girl on the Train. Or maybe it's a book from your childhood like Stuart Little, which shows the fact that you can be so different from your parents and still not lose their love. So I talk about these books and the lessons I learned from them. But what I really wanted to get across is that we all can have our books for living. There's no canon of great books that everyone has to read. Any book that is the right book for you at the right time can really be a gift of enormous proportion. And that's one of the things I love about your podcast is that it really shows people talking about exactly those books for living times in their own lives.
Yeah, I mean that if I read a book and I just get one line that changes me or helps me, I feel like it's been worth it to read that book.
That's exactly right. Sometimes it's a line or a paragraph, or sometimes it's almost like a misreading of the book. One of the books that I wrote about is Murakami's What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. And Haruki Murakami is obviously a beloved modern Japanese novelist, famous for books like A Wild Sheep's Chase. But he wrote this book about being a marathon runner. I am not a runner. I'm not even a jogger. I won't run for the bus. I'll get the next bus. So you wouldn't think that this book would speak to me. But there was a paragraph about how he also loves to take naps. And I'm a world-class napper. So this book for me, what I talk about when I talk about running is, for me, it's a book about napping. And I love that paragraph and I love the book.
So speaking of naps, one of the books that you recommended that's changed your life is The Importance of Living by Lin Yutang. And it seems like he's a big fan of naps as well.
Lin Yutang is, if I do nothing more than get more and more people to pick up The Importance of Living by Lin Yutang, I feel like that will be enough. This is the most extraordinary book. It was written in 1937, and it's a book really about how we need to work to live, not live to work. And it's a book about enjoying life's simple pleasures, about having tea with friends, about nature, but also the humanistic pleasures, about poetry and about art and the importance of these things. And yes, about taking naps. And it's an absolutely marvelous book. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages. And at first you think, oh, well, it's kind of, charming, maybe even a little silly. It's about explaining the Chinese way of life, scholastic way of life to readers around the world. But what's so extraordinary about this book is you realize that he's actually up to something very serious. Written in the late 30s, he starts to talk about the rise of Hitler and Stalin. And over the course of the book, you realize that what he's doing is positing humanistic values against the kind of totalitarian tide he saw sweeping across Asia and Europe. And it's really a book for our times. It's really a book about being fully human and not succumbing to greed, ambition, power.
That's really interesting because I think a lot of times when we think about books, we don't think about what they're reacting to.
Yes, exactly. It's fascinating to study books in terms of the time they were written. And I'm a real sponge for who wrote the book and what were they going through in their life at the time and what was going on in the place where they wrote it.
Do you ever, when you're reading a book like that, read 3 other books that kind of support the times?
I'm a big believer in having one book lead you to another. In fact, the reason I discovered Lin Yu Tang and the Importance of Living was because I'm obsessed with books that were written in the 1930s, and in particular with the author Christopher Isherwood, whose Berlin stories were made into cabaret.
Right.
And so reading Isherwood and reading books about Isherwood, what I kept seeing was this name, Lin Yu Tang and the Importance of Living. And apparently it was the biggest bestseller of the 1930s. Everybody was reading it. But by the time I came across it in all these books about the 30s, it had fallen completely out of print. So in fact, when I was at William Morrow and Company, another book publisher, I contacted Lin Yu Tang's daughters and arranged for the book to be brought back into print. And it's been in print ever since.
That's amazing. You know what I liked about it, because I saw when in your book, Books for Living, you describe it as a radical rejection of the philosophy of ambition.
Yes, he's a big believer in lying in bed in the morning and just staring out the window. And the sentence which perfectly encapsulates his view of the world is, if you've spent an absolutely useless afternoon doing absolutely nothing, you have mastered the art of living.
It's amazing. I mean, I was talking to someone recently who said the 3 biggest evils are money, power, and ambition. So it sounds like he's nailed that.
Yes, he really did. He really was. And it's an interesting lesson, too, because when you think about someone who everybody around the world was reading in the 1930s, and then for decades, outside of certain pockets in Asia, he had fallen completely out of fashion. No one was reading him. No one knew his name. But wonderfully, I mentioned Lin Yu Tang to my now 97-year-old aunt. And she said, oh, of course, Lin Yu Tang. He was the graduation speaker at my high school.
That's crazy. I mean, so, Will, what were you doing when you read this book? Like, how did it change your life?
Well, I was a very ambitious young man, a very ambitious young person. And around that same time, I had had a conversation with a colleague that made a deep impression on me. And in some ways, I think of that conversation and this book together. The colleague had said to me, where are you going on your annual vacation? She was actually quite a senior colleague. She was head of one of the children's book imprints. And I said, oh, I just don't think I can take a vacation this year. I'm just way too busy. And there was a pause. And she said to me, well, then you're a megalomaniac or you're a fool. And I was really taken aback. And she said, you're a megalomaniac if you think this place can't survive without you for 2 weeks. And you're a fool if you can take a 2-week vacation and you choose not to. And I thought,
wow.
Yes, I thought, wow. And at the same time, there was this book, The Importance of Living, and the two kind of converged. And that's when that idea came to me that I needed to pause and enjoy all the things that I was privileged enough to enjoy, like proximity to nature, or the fact that I have records I can listen to with wonderful music, or just sitting around on a day when the sun's coming in through the window and looking at the way the shadows fall on the mantelpiece. And that I was so busy and so ambitious that I was really missing the greatest pleasures that life has, which you just, it's a bit of a cliche, stop and smell the roses. But as with all cliches, there's some truth to it.
Definitely. I love it. Why don't we talk about Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin? Tell me about why this book changed your life.
This book is tied very deeply in my mind with an extraordinary woman, our school librarian, whose name was Miss Locke. I was at an Episcopal boarding school in Concord, New Hampshire, and this was the 70s, and I knew that I was gay, but there had never been an out gay student or faculty member in the history of our school. The atmosphere was very different, and I was a happy kid and got along with other kids and usually was in fine, but every now and then the idea of what life would be like for me would overwhelm me because I had picked up on all of the negative images that came through the media in so many different ways. And I would wander into the library just as a kind of refuge, sanctuary place to hide out. And sometimes Miss Locke would be there, and she was so great, and we would chat, and it was always cool to see her, and she just always made things feel okay. But once I wandered in and she wasn't there, and it was the time I usually wandered in, and I noticed there was a book on the library cart. And it was a book that seemed to speak to me, seemed to have been chosen for me. And Miss Locke would leave books, I believe, on the library cart for me to discover on those strange hours when I went in. And one of those books was Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. And this is a book. It's actually a very depressing book in the end, but it's a book about a young American named David in Paris who meets a young man named Giovanni. And before it turns so depressing, there are these marvelous scenes of David and Giovanni in love. And there was one in particular that stuck with me of them walking down a street in Paris in very high spirits, throwing, I think it was cherries into each other's mouths and laughing and just rejoicing in how beautiful the two of them were. And that book and passage was so important to me because it really gave me an image of a life that I could look forward to without dread. And I will always be grateful to James Baldwin, Giovanni's Room, but really more than anything to Miss Locke, the librarian, for putting that book in my way at exactly the moment I most needed it.
Should we talk about A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara?
I would love to talk about A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. Okay. A Little Life was a book that I'd heard several friends buzzing about, that they were reading and obsessed with. But actually, I had a friend who I think at the time was in his late 70s or early 80s. He was one of the most educated, brilliant people I knew. And I remember him, this wasn't leaving a book in my pathway. This was a full-on, Will, you have to read A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. And then he said something very interesting about it. He said, I think it's the best book on friendship that I've ever read. And because he was a dear friend, I took that very seriously. And I have this phenomenon that I call Shut Up, I'm Reading, which is when you're reading a book and really if anyone dares speak to you, you're furious with them. And I became obsessed with this. And I even, when I was about 75 pages from the end, don't tell my boss, I called in sick to work because I just had to finish the book. What I find so moving and devastating about this book, it's a beautiful portrait of a friendship among four friends. Don't worry, there are no spoilers. One of them has been horribly injured and is suffering terribly. And yet, throughout the book, pushes his friends away and makes it very hard for them to help him. And I really thought deeply about what it means to be a friend and what are the boundaries and responsibilities and what do you do with a situation where things are bad and not getting better. And friendship, in the best of times, is something easy and joyful, but the test of a friendship is the kind of situations presented with great dramatic effect in A Little Life. And The book is such an extraordinary book. The storytelling, the prose. It's a book I just devoutly love, and I love finding other people who love it. But it really caused me to think far more deeply than I've ever thought about what it means to be a good friend and whether I am and have been a good enough friend to my friends.
What do you think makes the best kind of friend?
I'd always heard there was something called the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then someone shared with me what they called the platinum rule. And the platinum rule is do unto others as they would want you to do unto them. That it's not putting everything through the litmus test of your experience. What would you want? How would you want to be treated? But to me, one of the great lessons and joys of reading A Little Life was this idea of being a friend is radical empathy. It's not putting everything in the context of yourself.
I love that. I love how you say it defines what it means to be a real friend, because I completely agree with you. Like, that dynamic between the four of them is educational and fascinating and really compelling. So do you want to talk about Why I Wake Early by Mary Oliver? How'd you find that book and how did it change you?
Oh, I'm so really glad. I love the opportunity to talk about Why I Wake Early by Mary Oliver, who was a national treasure, poet, winner of the National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize. And I'm especially moved to talk about her because she died in January of this year. And it's really not in some ways dissimilar from Lin Yu Tang. Mary Oliver found wonder as she walked around. And she engaged really deeply with nature and the natural world, but she also engaged really deeply with literature and with books and writers. And she had this open-eyed appreciation of everything around her. But she was tough too, and she recognized cruelty in the natural world and cruelty around her. And there was nothing soft about her poetry. It's just aware.
Why I Wake Early. Hello, sun in my face. Hello, you who make the morning and spread it over the fields and into the faces of the tulips and the nodding morning glories and into the windows of even the miserable and the crotchety. Best preacher that ever was, dear star that just happens to be where you are in the universe to keep us from ever darkness, to ease us with warm touching, to hold us in the great hands of light. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Watch now how I start the day in happiness, in kindness.
I think Mary Oliver is a very powerful antidote to our electronic world, our reactive world, a world where every tweet and every Instagram post causes us to have a kind of tiny judgment. And Mary Oliver reminds me to put down my cell phone, and even if it's just a little pocket park outside the door in my New York City neighborhood, just to go out there and kind of marvel, there's a tree, there's a statue, there's a squirrel, and just open myself up to the things that are right in front of me.
Well, I thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it. It's always fun to talk to you and talk about books.
Yeah, I know. It's so much fun. Thank you.
That's author and entrepreneur Will Schwalbe. Today we spoke about the books, Books for Living, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, The Importance of Living, Giovanni's Room, A Little Life, and Why I Wake Early. Books of Your Life is produced by me, Elizabeth, with Melissa Yeager-Miller, and with help from Danny Fakis and Sybil Wallace. Production help from Will Rogers and Craig Billmeyer. Our theme was composed by Mia Schettino. Audiobooks from Audible are a great way to get more books in your life. With the free Audible app, you can listen while commuting, doing chores, working out, anytime, anywhere on any device. Audible's unmatched selection includes my guest, Will Schwalbe's recommendation, Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. Get it free along with 2 selected Audible original titles when you start a 30-day trial or choose any other audiobook. To get started, just visit audible.com/Goodreads or text Goodreads to 500500.